The five of us hiked about 6 miles and finally made it to our campsite. It was still early spring in the Allegheny National Forest in western Pennsylvania. The trees were still budding. It was warm, but not too hot. We could see the Allegheny as we hiked along a ridge and down into our campsite right on the water. We dropped our packs from our shoulders and sat down for a moment before beginning to set up camp. It was quiet. Only the sounds of the wind and our footsteps were in the air. This is what outdoorsy folks call the shoulder season. Not really spring yet, but definitely not winter anymore. We saw only one hiker that day, and more importantly, we didn't see a single mosquito. 4 rabbis hike into an orchard, the Talmud tells us. The trees must have been ripe with their fruit. A fragrance was coming from the orchard, the sweet smell, the cut of vinegar from the rotting of the fallen produce on the ground. And among the trees, something happens. After seeing God, the divine presence, the Talmud tells us one of the rabbis dies. Another of the rabbis also sees and loses his mind. The third rabbi, after seeing the divine presence, in the language of the Talmud, chops down the roots of the trees. Or in other words, he becomes an apostate. The fourth rabbi, one of whom many of us have heard, Rabbi Akiva, comes out of the orchard safely and unharmed. As we started unpacking and setting up camp, it was hard to take the time to notice everything around us. We wanted to make sure that we were prepared for evening, setting up shelter, food, and water. When I finally had a moment to look around, there was so much to take in. The crunch of the leaves from the previous autumn, the sun streaming through the branches of the trees, the leaves still growing into their fullness of spring, the water lapping against the shore near our camp, the nearly indescribable smell of the forest, clean, fresh, a slight dampness, and even a touch of decomposition. It was glorious. In any healthy forest, life abounds, but so does death. The cycle of life, death, and return to the earth. As I sat processing wood for the evening's fire, I looked over at the edge of camp and saw 2 immense maple trees, trunks shooting straight up into the air. But there was something wrong. I had been at the campsite for a few hours, but was only just beginning to see it. These 2 trees standing side by side, maybe 10 feet from each other, were in great distress. The tree on the right had split. Its trunk, maybe 20 feet in the air, cleaved, leaning to the left, only still in the canopy because of the tree on the left still supporting it. It wasn't lightning. There was no sign of burning. It must just have been some inherent weakness in the wood. The tree on the right clearly experiencing a catastrophic event. I looked more closely at the tree on the left, and its trunk actually wasn't as straight as I originally thought. It was curving even further to the left, clearly supporting the weight. Around the tree on the left, the support tree was mounded up 2 or 3 feet. The cleaved tree was so heavy it was beginning to tear the support tree from the ground. Standing on the mounded earth, I realized it wasn't only that the support tree was holding up the cleaved tree, they were both supporting each other. I stood in the expanse between these 2 giants. I could see the roots of both trees reaching for each other. Under my feet, beneath the fertile soil, these root systems were deeply enmeshed. A weakness in the wood of one tree had created a situation wherein both trees experienced a potential catastrophe. They were neighbors. What happens to one affects the other. But their hidden strength, the thing that kept them from total loss, were the connections beneath the surface. Like us, they were hanging on to life. They were going through pain and supporting each other. We each have some brokenness. Yes, that is just the nature of being a living thing. And much like the trees, we also have roots reaching out to our community of neighbors. The years of growth together, the entanglement of life, those trees were locked together, their roots like fingers, gripping, holding, securing their mutual future. Those rabbis of the Talmud who enter the orchard, or pardes in the Hebrew, play out just a few lines. The fascination our tradition has with the story is enormous. Some of us may remember the Milton Steinberg book, As a Driven Leaf. It was based entirely on this short story. But more than 20th century novels, the narrative is seen as an important metaphor. The rabbi, the great danger, a willingness to explore beyond surface meaning, has its perils. And even though only one of the rabbis exited the orchard unscathed, pardes becomes the exegetical tool of the rabbinic tradition. As I mentioned earlier, pardes is understood to be an acronym, Pei, standing for pshat, or the simple, straightforward meaning, resh, standing for remez, separating what is hinted at by the text, Dalid for drash, ways of expounding upon the text, and samech for sod, hidden secrets to be revealed about the text. But it is no coincidence that pardes, the orchard, becomes the way our tradition suggests we might study the Torah. Trees are more than large plants. Anyone who has spent time with the trees, who has been in a place surrounded by the trees, knows that the trees are special, knows that the trees hold secrets. They are themselves waiting for the exegetical process of pardes. Throughout our sacred texts, trees have played a central role. Of course, the tree of knowledge of good and evil in Eden essentially begins the human story. The tree of life, Eitz Chaim in the Hebrew, is one of the ways we refer to our Torah. But the tree, as central character of our tradition, doesn't just end there. Just behind me is another wonderful example of trees in our tradition, this time comparing human beings to trees. On our ark doors, we read from the book of Jeremiah, "Blessed is the one who trusts in the eternal, and whose trust is the eternal. For that one shall be as a tree planted by waters, sending out its roots by a river. It does not notice when heat comes, and its leaves are always fresh. It does not worry in a year of drought, and it does not cease from bearing fruit." In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 19, words we read just a few weeks ago, we are commanded not to destroy trees, especially fruit-bearing trees, even though while sieging a city, it was the practice of others to do so. The 12th century French rabbi Joseph Bechor Shor understands the words "Ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh" as simile, saying in his commentary, "For a tree is like a human." That is, a tree can be called a human, whether it be a fruit tree or a barren tree. In a few weeks, as we gather in our Sukkot and shake the lulav and etrog, we bring 4 species of trees that our tradition compares to parts of the human. Is shaped like an eye, the willow leaf shaped like lips, and the etrog, the heart. But it is that tree of life that is the most well-known tree in Judaism. Eitz Chaim Hi. It is a tree of life for all who cling to it. We call the Torah an Eitz Chaim, our most sacred text, the tree of life. Trees are humans, humans are trees. The pardes, a place of cultivated trees, is a place to explore the deeper meaning of life and text around us. Trees are life, our tradition tells us. I could go on. There are many other examples of the centrality of trees and their symbolism in our religious tradition. Trees are a sort of explicit symbolism when we see them, when we recognize all they do for us. And clearly, as synthesis and carbon sequestration, the plainly observable aspects of trees are wonderful, but what happens with trees beneath the surface of the soil is mind-boggling. Suzanne Simard, a Canadian forest ecologist who recently published the book Finding the Mother Tree, does most of her research on communication between trees in the form of sharing nutrients. Simard has ventured into the Pardes, and she is discovering the sod, the secrets locked away in the trees. You see, the beauty of the forest and the collaboration of trees is clear enough from just observing them sitting at my campsite on the forest floor. But Dr. Simard has proven that trees share, that trees help, that trees know their offspring. Before Simard even began her research, scientists in laboratories were showing that trees could transfer nutrients to other trees. But that was in a lab, and it was unclear if it was a symbiotic relationship. Were the trees transferring nutrients back and forth? So Simard began her experiment in the mountain clearcuts of British Columbia. She took plastic bags, injecting them and covering young saplings with these bags with tracer isotope carbon dioxide gases. And she injected different form trees with a shade to stop photosynthesis. Simard used 2 carbon isotopes because she wondered whether there was two-way communication going on between these species. She waited an hour, figuring it would take that long for the trees to suck up the CO2 through photosynthesis, turn it into sugars, and send it down into their roots. Simard went to her first bag with the birch pulled off the bag, ran the Geiger counter, an instrument that measures radioactivity, over its leaves, and the counter went wild. The birch had taken up the radioactive gas. Then the moment of truth. Simard went over to the fir tree, pulled off its bag, ran the Geiger counter, talking to the fir. The birch was saying, "Hey, can I help you?" And the fir was saying, "Yeah, you can send me some of your carbon because somebody threw a shade over me." One of the most fascinating parts of Simard's research is how these trees share information and nutrients. It isn't just that the root systems touch each other. No, it isn't really the roots at all. These trees share using a third species, and it comes from an entirely different kingdom: fungi, mushrooms. The mycorrhiza of the fungi, the thin web of white and red and blue and yellow fingers of the fungi that cover nearly every inch of fertile soil on the planet, are the conduit of communication between trees. These fungi are responsible for the decomposition of our world. They turn organic and even inorganic matter back into usable elements. In their decomposition, they allow for life to continue and regeneration to occur. And as I read Simard's book and came closer to understanding her research, we lean on each other in hard times and good times. When we face catastrophe, it is other human beings that reach out, that we hope will support us through the cleaving we are experiencing. Sometimes we feel more like the cleaved tree, and sometimes the support tree. But in truth, we are always both. For as is the case with the very word, to cleave is to come apart, but also to hold on firmly. And those mycorrhizal connections between those roots, between the trees, that allows for sharing, that allows for transfer, that allows for growth, it is similar to the energy of our universe, the oneness of our universe. Adonai, that which was, that which is, that which will be. This is one of the ways I understand God's role in our lives. God is the mechanism of our connections, the thin web of networking that makes it possible for me, standing on the strong trunks of my legs, living in the canopy of my mind, to reach out and connect with you. Of course, the fungi are not just a superhighway for the transfer of nutrients between trees. The fungi benefit from the relationship as well. They receive sugar from the trees, a nutrient they cannot make themselves but need to survive. So too, just as we need each other and we need God, God needs us. We are in a symbiotic relationship with God. Yes, we tend to think of our search for God, our belief in God, but God is as much in search of us as we are of the divine. God is looking for us, and God has faith in us. As Rabbi Abraham Heschel puts in God in Search in Man, when Adam and Eve hid from God's presence, God called, uttered in words, not conveyed in categories of the mind, but ineffable and mysterious, as ineffable and mysterious as the glory that fills the whole world. It is wrapped in silence, concealed and subdued, yet it is as if all things were the frozen echo of the question, "Where are you?" And it should therefore come as no surprise that the prayer that stands at the center of our worship, the prayer that every Jew knows in their heart more than any other, isn't really a prayer to God at all, but a calling to ourselves. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, we say to ourselves. Truly hear the oneness of God, the connected mycelium of the universe, the Sod, the secret of our existence. This is our job, and this is our existence. Discover the secret of each person's existence, all of us. What is that person's unique existence? Discover it. Yes, God is waiting for us to call these words aloud. We once thought trees were pieces of wood stuck in the earth, but now we know they are symbolic of all we are and all we hope to be. I mentioned earlier that we call the Torah Eitz Chaim. We probably all knew that already. What many of us probably didn't know is that the rollers that the Torah is connected to. Torah is only a Torah when the founding words, the nutrients of Judaism, the narrative of our people, and our experience of God is sown on two trees of life. Eitz Chaim Hi. It is a tree of life for those who cling to it. Shana Tova.